Video 61. Now this video is called Imprinting the Ether. So maybe someone's going to be excited because this one we're actually going to start to talk about how to do some wizarding. So last time we introduced the concept of the ether, mostly in a scientific way. But this is also a topic that has been the subject of mystical contemplations all the way back. Because, as we observe the world around us, we see that, things emerge into manifestation through a gradual process, like a baby being born. It grows and grows and grows, and then it comes out and it's visible in its whole substance. Or like, seeds go underground and they're unseen, and then gradually they pop through the surface. And just in such a way, things manifest out of a subtle, hidden condition into an observable, active condition in our reality. And we never observe really something come from nothing. So there has to be this pre-existing substrate, a subtle substrate that's invisible to the eyes and the senses, in which things exist in a very subtle way. So, and this has been speculated on in all the religions, going all the way back. So, what is the nature of manifestation? In Neoplatonic thought and Kabbalah, which I keep coming back to, there's what's called emanationism, which is, saying that things emerge into being from the mind of the creator, if you will. And, we can observe this in our lives, where we get an idea for something, we get a flash of insight, or we get a grasp of the necessity of some course of action, or some object which we create, or a symbol. So the idea comes first, and then it goes through a gradual process. Sometimes it can be growth, like plants, like a tree, or like crops that we plant and then harvest. And so, as we can see, the way all these things develop, like a plant, let's say an apple tree, right? Like you plant an apple tree because you want apples, but in order to get the apples, the tree has to go through this long-term growth process. And it starts out as a sapling, which doesn't have any of the characteristics of a full-grown tree. Like, it's all soft and flexible. It doesn't have big branches. It doesn't have blossoms. It doesn't have fruits. So, but out of the sapling comes all these things. Eventually, they manifest into being. And so we know that there's some underlying pattern within a seed or within a tiny sprout of a plant. There's some pattern innate within that thing that eventually manifests into fullness of being. And so it is with our personal creations. And I think one of the best things about our world right now is what I call the marriage of science and spirituality, and I was always into both of these things. But I noticed when I was in high school that my friends that were scientists and mathematicians and so forth, they would have certain hobbies. They'd be really into chess, or they would be really into, puzzles and different things, but they wouldn't really have much of a spiritual concept of the mystical. But there's one crossover, which is role-playing games and Tolkien style fantasy. It seems like the science nerds, or Star Trek, the science nerds did seem to find interest in those things, which to me is evidence of this deep connection between science and the mystical that goes back to the wizards and ancient alchemists, of 1,000 years ago. So in our modern world now, I'm starting to encounter more and more people that are into this unity, and some of them come at it from a purely mathematical point of view. But then, by doing so, they discover this really wacky dimension of spirituality and mysticism, where the depth of these patterns that they can see goes beyond the explanation of just, oh, this is just logical. It's like the pattern is so intricate and it's so universal that there is this awesome element to it where you're just in awe and wonder about the pervasiveness of these patterns and how it's everywhere. And the concept of intelligent design creeps into the most atheistic, nihilistic mindset. You realize that it's not possible for all this to just be random. Despite all the brainwashing of the past century into the atheist, secularist worldview, it's cracking through. And to me, I started with physics. That was my first love. And that's, you start reading these books like the Dancing Woolly Masters or the Tao of Physics and stuff like that. And you see that all these physicists, even Einstein, Isaac Newton, was major into Kabbalah and Bible codes, and Einstein was a Kabbalist. Richard Feynman, one of my first heroes, he was also way into Kabbalah and number theory. And so there's this crossover that's happening, and up until very recently, people like Nassim and stuff came out. Up until very recently, the scientists would have to hide that aspect because it was such a dogmatic political correctness. If you're seen as mystical in the scientific community, you're just ostracized and hated upon. But anyway, okay, that was a long divergence and introduction, which I tend to get into. But now we're going to talk about imprinting the ether. So the concept that we introduced last time was the ether, this invisible substrate, this wave membrane that becomes the medium for light and subtle energies to transmit through. So there's a concept called scalar field theory, which is a big part of this. And a lot of these, government scientists and university researchers that started studying psychic phenomena and paranormal phenomena at Duke University and Stanford Research Institute and places like this, they tend to look at scalar field theory as one of the possible scientific paradigms that can explain, telepathy and all these different psychic phenomena. And I think that's pretty good. It's worth looking into if nothing else. It may not be a full explanation, but recently I started reading the Stargate and Crest documents on the CIA website, talking about a lot of this stuff and the remote viewing programs. And so once they realized that there was documentable evidence of these paranormal non-locality phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, and so on, they wanted to just have some explanation of how it works so that they can control and manipulate it and monopolize it if possible. And so that's why for decades all these documents were secret in these government archives. But now, you can go right on your web browser and pull it all up. And it's, by no means complete, for sure. They keep all the good stuff to themselves. But there's enough there for you to speculate, that if they're inventing these program names and they have all these documents, there's more to it. There's more that's not being told. And an interesting thing that I learned about from Freeman Fly, shout out to Freeman, he talked about this, he interviewed this guy, Isaac Bonowitz, who has, I think, a master's degree or a PhD from UC Berkeley in magic. And his thesis that became the basis of that was called the psychotronic weapon, which became like a HARP antenna array. But he published his thesis before that stuff was really publicized. But basically the idea was that through electrostatic and microwave technology, you could influence the psyche and consciousness of humanity on a mass scale. So I'm just saying all that as a way to introduce the concept that through technological means, there's a way to in essence, imprint this etheric field or the scalar field with information, imagery, energy that can proliferate and influence people at a distance and on a massive scale. So that's just to kind of show you that this is somewhat of a legitimate phenomena that's been studied and exploited by the very wealthy and powerful within our governments and within corporations. And I mean, I would say that the secret societies have been using this thousands of years, you know, and the Masonic whole cult is kind of the one that people are most familiar with today, but there's a lot of offshoot groups and other groups involved with that. And you know, a lot of these religious groups too are involved with that. And so they realized, I think in the 40s, after the advent of like the Thule Society and the Nazi Party and all these groups being like spending millions and tons of manpower trying to investigate all this stuff, you know, by the 60s, you know, we got this massive explosion of like the Process Church of the Final Judgment and Scientology and, you know, Charles Manson and all these groups like putting tons and tons of energy into controlling people's minds and having them become basically willing slaves. And so that is one of the darker aspects of this, is that you can imprint a person willfully with whatever you desire, and it doesn't really have to make logical sense. And so, you know, in witchcraft too, the whole satanic panic of the 80s and 90s, which I think was merely the tip of the iceberg. Not only was it not a fake panic by the religious right, but they're at like 0.1% of what's really there. And if you were to find out about that, you would learn about people like Michael Aquino, the US, I think he was a lieutenant colonel. I think he might have been promoted to a higher rank than that, but yeah, started a satanic temple of Set, you know, stuff like that. And if people were to find out the crossover between the US government and these occult and satanic groups, people would not even accept it. They would just block it out. But there's so much documentation out there. But anyway, I keep getting so off track here and going way off of what I was trying to do. But this topic is about, personally, how do we utilize this technology in our lives in a positive way, not only in a way of like self-defense to like protect from the pernicious influence of propaganda and psychological manipulation, but to actually achieve our goals, to obtain self-improvement, self-mastery, and so forth. So the previous maybe 4 or 5 videos have all been kind of a setup for this, because we're talking about these different physical elements in the world and psychological elements within our consciousness. And all of these need to be really tapped into in order to truly master what I call ether imprintation. And so, or ether imprinting. And this is something that for me, as I'm making these videos, has just dramatically skyrocketed, to the extent that, like, say in the morning, you know, I'll make a video like this, or I'll contemplate, or I'll watch videos from other people, or like make certain art, make music. And then that night I'll have lucid dreams about it all. It's like successfully fully imprinting into my subconscious. And then when I go to sleep, my subconscious is like just continuing the work for me. And this is something that I've had success with for decades, but now it's just like skyrocketing. And a lot of that I attribute to dispersing this out and communicating it to other people. But so now that we've got less than a minute left, my point is to say that you can use all your senses. You know, I like art. I'm really visual. So I get into stuff like sigil magic, rune magic, and just whatever types of art you can do visually to sort of encode and encapsulate the concepts of what you want to attract into your life, what you want to manifest, skills that you want to develop, and so on. But you can use music, you can use aroma and scents, you can use physical movements is a really good one. But in essence, all 5 senses and all types of activity can be used to imprint this ether field. And so this not only gets into your own subconscious mind, but you can start to manifest outer circumstances in the world that will bear this out.